Welcome to the Into Novus Knowledge Agronomy Podcast, your go-to resource for agronomic insights, technology solutions, and ongoing education. At Into, we combine agronomic expertise from soil analysis to best practice application methodologies to provide a holistic view for your yield optimization. Our focus is on practical strategies that improve efficiency and drive better results in the field. Join us for interesting discussions, expert advice, and the latest advancements shaping modern agriculture. Whether you're in the field, on the road, or at your facility, we're here to keep you informed ahead of the curve. All right, welcome to our second Into podcast. I'm Nick Monnig, joined with Derek Cottrill again from Northwest Missouri, and today we got Rodney Phelps with us. Rodney, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning. Rodney Phelps, covering Northern Illinois and Diamond Ag, working with Diamond Ag.
Just quick update, I guess, planting progress, etc., from the different areas. I'm in Central Missouri, and it is wet again. We really haven't done much in 2 weeks since the rain Easter weekend. So we do have some crops up, everything except the stuff planted right before Easter there, but we're wet. But Rodney, I think you got a different story.
Yeah, in Northwest Illinois, we've got a large percentage of the corn and the beans planted, and a large percentage of emerged. Some areas are a little damp, but for the most part, we could use some rain. So I'm very cognizant of the geography of how lucky we are compared to Nick and Derek.
Derek?
Yeah, for Northwest Missouri, similar to Rodney, is planning's moving really fast. We're outpacing the average in both corn and soybeans. So crops going in the ground fast. Now, I guess I'm kind of in between both of you guys, where Nick's really wet and Rodney's hasn't got as much rain. It's been very spotty across my territory. So, the last rain that came through, we saw anywhere from 1.5 inches to a couple tenths, depending on where you're at. So, in any given case, guys have been able to keep running clear through the spring, but we're not hurting for moisture either. So really sitting pretty good.
Yeah, okay. We just wanted to cover a few timely topics today. First off, we're going to start with just kind of a pest update. So mainly focused on weeds and then some insect pests to be mindful of. Then we'll switch into, making stand assessments. And for me, maybe some of those acres I got planted right before Easter, some of that's starting to come through, and I think we'll be fine. But there's a few acres we might need to think about replant decisions on. So we'll mention that. The other guys might cover some of the how we're going to assess stand as far as how well did the planter do. And then we'll move on from there. We'll talk about growth and development. So where we at with the major crops and kind of lead us into what we're going to talk about next time. So I guess I'll get it started. But on the weed side of things, we've in Central Missouri, we've been wet. And I know this is not something that maybe Rodney's been dealing with, but my geography, we have fields that didn't get fall sprayed because we got too wet. And then we didn't get them burned down early this spring, whether it's been windy or it's been wet. And now we've been wet for a long time. And now we have fields that have not been burned down, namely a lot of them going to soybeans. We have mare's tail that's getting some real size on it. We have water hemp emerging. So it's kind of what do we do? We're behind the 8 ball now. And so from a mare's tail aspect, I guess it gives me a little cause for concern because going and burn down mare's tail on April 1st in Central Missouri is a way different deal than going out there and dealing with it on May 1st. Some of the mare's tail I've been looking at 7, 8, 10, 12 inches tall, start to get some size on it, and that gets pretty hard to control. So as I think about it, rescue applications, which is what we're going to be getting into, those can be somewhat problematic with mare's tail, and they can also be somewhat expensive depending on how you go about it. From my aspect, as I think about it, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, you want to control it really, really well. You could run a Cadillac treatment. There's some 3-way mixtures. You can look at lots of data. I've looked at stuff in the past just from my own experience, and there's some mixtures that work really well. We started incorporating things like Sharpen, Metribuzin, 2,4-D, glyphosate, Liberty. So, you start thinking about combinations, what could work, something with glyphosate, Liberty, Sharpen together, or glyphosate, Liberty, 2,4-D together, or another one that works really well is when we start running Gamoxone, 2,4-D, and Metribuzin. That mix works really well as well. But those can be sometimes expensive, and they can be sometimes hard for guys to want to stomach. So then I guess the other thing I think about, what else could you do? And that starts coming into rates. And as I think about rates, pretty common practice for us anymore is to run a pint of LV6 in a burn down when we're out there in early April. My concern, though, is a pint of LV6 on mare's tail that's 12 inches tall may not totally take that thing out. And especially if we're out for another 7 days and then it gets even bigger, or 2 weeks. And so, how do you handle it at that point? So, if you don't want to go to some kind of big through a mixture, then your next thing is to start thinking about rates. And you really, that pint of LV6 probably really ought to become a full 1 pound of acid equivalent 2,4-D, which means we need to be up there at like LV6, 22, 23 ounces of product. And that will, I think, be light years better than just running 16 ounces. Now, it may not be as good as some of those three-way mixes, but you need to be cognizant of that. The other thing I should mention to you, though, is then you got to think about plant bag, because even with Enlist soybeans, you got to start thinking about what's the plant bag and follow what the label says. So that's another thing, I guess, to be mindful of. And then the last thing I will say on an optimistic standpoint about the mare's tail, something you probably couldn't say 10 years ago, if we miss it in the burn down, the fact that we've got Enlist soybeans now, or even an Extend Flex where you use Liberty and glyphosate together, compared to what we maybe could do 10, 12 years ago. If we miss that mare's tail in this pass, we ding it up. Likely, if we run a good enough load, let's say of 2,4-D and in Liberty on the post pass, or even a good load of glyphosate and Liberty on the post pass, we're likely going to take it out. And so that, I guess, is somewhat optimistic for the situation that we're in. The last thing I guess I'd say, Derek, is hindsight's 2020, but man, mare's tail control is so much easier in the fall, and so whatever we can do to try to get that fall application on, it does not take much to control it if we do it then versus now when it's up and bolting. But just some things I wanted to mention on mare's tail. I guess, Derek, I'm going to flip it over to you, because now we've got summer annuals merging, especially problematic weeds like water hemp, and now how are we going to handle that where we don't have something down?
Right. Yeah, and that's you bring up some good points there on the soybeans, and I think a lot of those principles can be applied to on the corn side as well. And you mentioned the fall application really comes back to proactive. Really, if there's one key to weed control and staying clean, it's being proactive, and a fall herbicide app is a way to do that. Which I guess on the corn side of the thing leads me into some of the biggest discussions I'm having right now in terms of corn weed management is that early post one pass uh, program and what that looks like the later we get into the season here in those fields where we don't have anything down yet. So especially no-till fields. But I will say, even for the conventional or the tillage guys, those fields go untouched for another couple of weeks. Now we're talking about hitting those fields twice. The winter annuals are getting pretty intense and big enough out there. They're going to cause some issues, even prepping the field for planting, even if you're planning on doing tillage. So be mindful of that. But if you're in a no-till situation and planning on still just doing a burn down, one big thing I would caution guys, a lot of times with that early post one pass, they want to try to wait till that V2, V3, even later to get that put on. That way, that one application can ride us closer to canopy closure. I will caution guys doing that, though, and keep in mind we need to be basing our applications on weed size, not necessarily our growth stage of our corn. If corn went in just here over the last couple of days and we're waiting till that corn gets to V3, V4 to hit it with a herbicide, our fields that are no-till, those weeds are going to be beyond probably what we can't control. But even if we can, we're going to run into a situation like we did last year. Nick mentioned the winter annuals coming up. So water hemp, lamb's quarter, things like that. I was out in fields yesterday taking pictures of seedling lamb's quarter and seedling water hemp. Those will continue to emerge under the canopy of winter annuals. And last year, a major issue in Northwest Missouri was guys, by the time they got into the fields to spray, they're taking out big winter annuals, and they actually did a pretty impressive job on most of those. So the pennycrest, the mare's tails that Nick was talking about, pretty good job on those. But guess what? Right underneath the canopy of winter annuals you just killed was a flush of summer annuals coming through. And so the bigger our winter annuals get, whether we can control them or not, we're going to start overlapping with the summer annual emergence. And so full rates, making sure we're hitting season maximum. So a Callisto type product, a Meso type product making sure we're maximizing our season maxes on those types of products. We might have to beef up, I guess, if you would, our herbicide tank mixes as we're going into some of these on the post sides, but be diligent and monitor that weed control, because again, if we're waiting until the post window to spray, we don't control all our weeds, our chance to come back, or that window to come back again, whether we want to or not, is going to be getting smaller and smaller by the minute. So monitor weed control, use the full rates, and be diligent there. So.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, Derek. And one thing I guess I'll add on that mesotrione is just thinking through the fact that if you have a season maximum of 7.7 ounces, if you burn through a lot of that on the pre-emergence, just keep in mind you may not have something on the post. So just be sure you balance that in case you have to come back again, or you'll have to run something else. When it comes to water hemp, I didn't mention it in soybeans, but when it comes to water hemp control, just a lot like mare's tail. Just be sure if you've got a field that's not been burnt down, we got mare's tail there, we've got water hemp coming. Just be sure you're running a high enough rate or a good enough mix on that water hemp to totally take it out. The last thing you want to do is ding up a little water hemp and let it come through later. With that said, Rodney, from you on a standpoint, insect wise, what should we be looking out for right now?
Yeah, so a comment I'll make on the what we're just talking about water hemp, and that, remember, overlapping residuals, so that we kind of I know you guys there in the south are a little different, but up here in the north, make sure we're using overlapping residuals so that that water hemp doesn't escape. With that being said, and the guys have been talking about winter annuals, and black cutworm loves winter annuals and cover crop following. So need to be cognizant and watch for black cutworm feeding. They love the winter annuals, and you guys in the south, it appears that you've got a lot of that. So the black cutworm, just be cognizant they are catching moths, and there's a lot of flights of those. So watch for the crop in that V1, V2 stage. If you start seeing shot holes, you're going to have some feeding. Also, keep an eye out for true armyworm. The southern regions are catching moths at full flight. So, true armyworm's another insect that loves the winter annuals and the cover crop type products. One side note I'll say while we're talking bugs, fall armyworm, it's going to be more of a later hatch, but we could be having a situation of fall armyworm and alfalfas and legume. They love legumes, so we want to be cognizant of bugs. It just seems like, yeah, we're talking weeds, but we got bugs to keep our mind watching also.
I appreciate that, Rodney. Yeah, especially down south if you're planting into a mess of winter annuals with corn. Yeah, and it's not been planted yet. You really need to be mindful of the black cutworm. With that, one of the other topics we wanted to mention was just stand assessment, replant decisions. And from that standpoint, most of the stands I've looked at in my geography look really good. I think the only challenges we're going to have, maybe some poorly drained soils, maybe pushed a little bit and then planted literally right ahead of that Easter weekend rain. So I don't know outside of that we'll have a lot of issues, but you gotta, if you have to assess something from a replant situation, corn really depends where you're at. It really depends how uniform that stand is. But from my standpoint, common upland dirt in Missouri, kind of the baseline I start with is 20,000. Then I take in the personality of the grower, what the yield potential of the field is, how uniform it is, how many gaps it has. So if it's common upland dirt, it's an even 20,000. The grower has a normal expectation on yield. That's probably enough. But you get less than 20,000, you're probably going to have to redo it. And then if it's a higher yielding field, we probably need to be closer to the upper 20s from that standpoint. But just so you have a rough idea, good baseline is 20 and work your way up or down or work your way up from there. On the soybean side of things, if you got into a replant situation, just keep in mind all the data says and all the experience, you don't replant them, you just thicken them up. And with soybeans, if you want to be really conservative, 100,000. If you're above 100 or at 100, you've got plenty. I'll go less than that. I mean, I'll take an even stand of 80,000. I've seen an even stand of 75 make 100% yield. So that doesn't bother me. There's data from Purdue, there's data from Wisconsin that are down in the 60s and 50s. That would make me nervous. I would thicken up a stand like that, just the geography I'm in. But some of their data says you're better off to leave 66,000 than you are to replant it. And then the bigger question on soybeans is, okay, I need to replant. How much do I add? Well, just keep in mind, the idea is to get to a target stand of 140,000. That's a good rough rule of thumb. Keep in mind, you might remove a few. Best thing you can do is go in at an angle with 30-inch row or 15-inch row planter and plant back into those. Just try to target that 140,000. Keep in mind, you might lose a few, but the bigger thing when you go to thickening up stands is just you don't want to add way too many either, because you can cost yield if you get them way too thick. So just some thoughts to be cognizant of. With that said, Rodney, you're not really in a replant situation. You're more in a planter assessment and how did we do grade card, so to speak. You want to make any comments on how you do that?
Yeah, so in my travels, looking at emerged corn and emerged beans, very uniform stands. Also very healthy at this stage of the crop. So we're off to a good start, and I would say our farmers have done a great job of making sure that planter was set correctly and operating correctly. So we're not. I don't anticipate much, if any, replant, and I don't anticipate any emergence issues on the crop that's left to emerge.
Derek, where you want to mention anything from your geography,
Yeah.
especially on stuff not planted yet?
Yeah, and I guess yeah, that's around planning agronomics, and you're talking about replant. I guess we still got an opportunity to avoid having to replant at all, I guess. And so my discussions have been around not rushing back into wet planting conditions, things like that. Like I said, the rain's been really spotty. Some areas have gotten a lot, but even within a particular farm, a guy could have dry acres and acres that were too wet. That's how spotty that it's been. And I would just caution guys. I know we all want to get planted as quickly as possible. I'm a big fan of early planting dates and things like that as well. But even more important is that uniform emergence, stress-free emergence. And the problem with planting in wet conditions, the issues that it causes in terms of compaction, poor root development, uneven emergence, things like that, those are irreversible. Those will be pretty dramatic on yield. And there's nothing we can do about them once it happens, except potentially replant, right? Which is never an end goal at all. So just be cautious, be patient. Usually I tell guys, if you're calling me to ask me if the soil's fit for planting, it's probably not. So just think about that. And if it needs one more day, it's going to be well worth it in terms of the potential yield loss you'll have from planting in wet conditions. So.
Okay, lastly, the last thing we want to discuss was growth and development, just on the crops that we currently have planted. And we're just going to go through, some of the top crops that we deal with anyways. And so we're going to talk wheat, corn, soybeans. From a wheat standpoint, I'll handle that. I know not everyone has wheat acres, but for those of you that do, where we're at in central Missouri, we're currently in the boot stage. We do on some of the earlier planted fields have some heads starting to poke through, so that flowering application, that head scab application of fungicide is right around the corner for us. And some of those fields, the earlier ones, probably going to hit this weekend. The other ones next week. We're getting real close to that. And if conditions stay the way they're at right now, which is rainy, overcast skies, high humidity, perfect conditions for head scab. And man, to protect the quality of the wheat, reduce the DON levels, and to protect the yield, that head scab fungicide, in my opinion, is a must. And so it's basically the last management pass on wheat. It's beginning flowering is when we make that application. You start to see some anthers hanging on that plant. It's a good time to go. And just so you guys are aware, all the data that's out there says you're better to miss. If you can't hit it perfect, miss a little late than a little early. So just keep that in mind. You can still get full benefit, or close to full benefit. I shouldn't say full, but close to it, even being a couple days late. So with that, Derek, you want to mention where we're at with these early soybean acres?
Yeah, for soybeans, I think a lot of times we don't think as much about these early stages in beans, like say we would with corn and that even emerges and things like that. But there's some pretty critical stages, even though our soybeans are small right now, they might be approaching unifoliate. potentially even some of the earliest getting to that V1 or first unfurled trifoliate there. But there's some important things going on in the plant right now, and in terms of energy supply, those cotyledons are going to supply the plant with the energy that it needs for only roughly about 10 days or so. But once we start hitting, say, that V2, which we will be probably in the next week or so in some of our earliest planted beans, that's when that nodulation is going to start to occur, and it'll actually start to produce nitrogen, supply nitrogen to the plant through nodulation around V2. But that V2 stage is also another critical stage, and we're just talking about weed control and getting beans cleaned up. After V2, that's when research has shown significant yield losses. Weeds are going to start up to 2% yield loss per day for weeds still present after V2, and that percentage just grows for every growth stage after that we don't have those weed controls. So again, being diligent, if we have beans up, we got to get them cleaned up as soon as we can, because they'll start having yield impacts. But in terms of our growth stage right now and how fast we're growing, up through V5, every 5 to 7 days, we should be moving to a new trifoliate. Later on in the season, that'll probably switch to every 3 to 5 days, moving through stages. But right now, normal growing conditions, every 5 days or so, you're probably going to be putting on a new trifoliate. But currently, that's where we're at with most of our beans right now, or at least the furthest along plants.
Appreciate that, Derek. Rodney, where are we at with this emerged early planted corn?
Yeah, so corn's fast approaching, the early emerged fast approaching V2 and V3. And a very critical thing starts to happen at that stage. The corn is going to switch from living off the starch in the kernel to the seminal roots. And so we go through what I call an ugly stage sometimes, depending on the hybrid, of it may have a yellowing or a paling effect when it's switching from the living off the starch into the seminal roots. So there is opportunity, especially on higher yielding fields or operations that are wanting the higher yields, of doing some nutritionals or things at that stage to help take the stress off of the corn crop, so that it can not have a bad day.
Rodney, what's next up with that corn? After we get past V2, V3, then what's the next big critical stage?
Yeah, so we need to be thinking, once we get that corn past V3 into V4, 5, we need to start looking at our nitrogen and other nutrient requirements for that crop. And that's where we need to be thinking of side dress, top dress, wide dropping. And I think as we move forward in our next podcast coming, we'll address some of the opportunities and products that we can be using on that crop at this critical stage, so that we do get the higher yields that we're all shooting for.
Appreciate that, Rodney. Appreciated Derek as well. So hopefully we provide you guys with a little bit of a few tidbits of what's going on in the field, what we need to be thinking about the next couple of weeks. And with that, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Into Novus Knowledge. Please reach out to your Into agronomist if we can help in any way. Join us next time for more in-depth agronomic advice.